This week's guest on Here Comes Pod has built a career in TV based on his deep knowledge of programming from around the world, but he remains a quintessentially British gentleman. Antony Root took his love for the theatre into the BBC and ended up running original programming at HBO Europe. Along the way, he told tales of the city at working title, expanded the international footprint at Sony Pictures, and conquered America for Granada Television. We talked about the perils of script development on Doctor Who, the vital role the BBC plays in curating British writers and culture, and the brand and programming evolution at HBO as it brings Max to the global market. Enjoy. Hi, Antony. Welcome to the pod.
Hello, Danny. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, my absolute pleasure. I always like to start with a fun question, which is, TV series and films are often now turned into theatre plays. If you could produce a West End version of any TV series, which one would you choose to produce?
Blimey. Well, that is a fun question. If I think about it, the big hitters in the West End of Broadway have always been from huge IP. You know, it's Frozen or Harry Potter, Stranger Things, that kind of thing. And one thing I did think about was if I was Netflix, I would be making a musical from Bridgerton. Romantic, sweeping narrative, costume extravaganza, huge transformational scenes and period drama. I think that could be an immense success, and of course it's a very well established IP. But the other end of the spectrum, we did a show In Treatment. We must have done it at HBO Europe. We must have done, I don't know, 300 or 400 episodes across 4 territories. You certainly wouldn't want to put your own money into it, but I can see in a sort of off West End or fringe space with significant casting how you could make an absolutely spellbinding plays from some of those cases with just 2 characters on the stage, and occasionally maybe you would introduce a 3rd or a 4th. But I thought that would work pretty well, and I did think it at the time. It was quite a, quote, theatrical, unquote, format to start with. If I was privileged enough to be in New York, the other thing I'd love to see, and I'd pay money to see, would be if somebody could do a show based on Schitt's Creek, because I thought it's a small cast, beautifully contained stories, hilariously funny. It's probably the last comedy series I watched sort of all the way through. Again, a smaller kind of show. But anyway, I don't think I'm in the angel business investing in shows, or indeed in the producing business investing in shows. I've only had one producing credit in the West End, and that was when I was 21, and it was a Footlights review at the Comedy Theatre. And that was pretty bruising.
Well, that was actually the reason why I chose that question, because it seemed to me that theatre was perhaps a little bit of a first love. What was your bigger passion in your early years, TV or theatre?
Oh, it was theatre without a doubt. My family were late adopters, frankly, to TV. I don't think we had a TV till I was 10 or 11. I don't remember rightly. I do remember running around to friends to watch Z-Cars episodes. And I do remember hiding behind the sofa of the vicar's house to watch William Hartnell doing a Doctor Who in the very early, so we're talking the early 60s. But I did fall in love with theatre very, very young. I was born and raised in Cambridge, and comedy actor, comedian actually, Cyril Fletcher used to come every other year to do the pantomime. Aladdin 1 year, Mother Goose said 2 years later. And I absolutely got totally involved in all of this. And one year I remember going up on stage and thinking it was the greatest experience in the world, you know. So I pursued that love really all through school plays. And then I went to the National Youth Theatre when I was a teenager, did 2 years in the National Youth Theatre, 1 in stage management, 1 in sort of small part acting. And then by the time I got to university, I knew what I wanted to do from about 14. I knew the business I wanted to be in. And at university, I did a lamentable amount of academic work. It's really, I have sleepless nights still how I got away with it. But I was involved in about 21 shows over the 3 years. Occasionally performing, and I thought I was going to be a theatre director, and then I did do quite a few shows, some of which were okay, and then I had a calamitous, catastrophic production that really made me decide this was not what the future was, being a director.
So you have this theatre background. possibly this catastrophic experience was something that played a part in your thinking. But I guess then the question is, how did you make the move into TV, specifically at the BBC? And was it a fantastic training ground for an up and coming creative executive?
Yes, it absolutely was. Well, just a little bit of background to that. My first job was as assistant theatre manager at the New London Theatre, now the Gillian Lynn, in my dicky bow tie, making sure the gin hadn't been watered down by the bar staff. And then I moved on to be general manager in the theatre, and then I did press and PR for a little while. The highlight of which I have to say was having lunch with Tennessee Williams, because I was representing a show called Vieux Carré that went into the Piccadilly. And I got to a point in my mid-20s when I didn't want to go into the theatre, go on in the theatre, not least because you have no other life at all. You're working evenings every 6 nights a week. At Cambridge, I had done some reviews, and there'd been a splinter group from Footlights called Adams Smith Adams, another review group. And Douglas Adams, who became very famous later for writing The Hitchhiker's Guide, was one of those. And Douglas was the script editor on Doctor Who. So I looked him up. He wasn't a close personal friend, but he was a good chum. And I said, so what's with this television thing? And he said, oh, that's interesting. Tony, he always called me Tony, even though I'd like to be called Anthony. And he said, I think you should go and speak to Graham MacDonald, who was the head of series and series at that time in the BBC. He kindly arranged for me to go in and see him. And Graham said to me, there's two ways into this. You could be a script editor. Some people come in as a script editor, or they come in as an assistant floor manager. And I didn't have the nerve at that time to say, oh, I could script edit this, that, and the other. So I signed up for a holiday relief assistant floor manager, 3-month contract, actually on Doctor Who, funny enough, and then gained a permanency. So I spent the first 2 years or more as an assistant floor manager, marking up the floors, running around with the props, calling the artists, dragging them out of bed on location when they hadn't shown up, and all the things that second assistant directors, we used to call them assistant floor managers. I proceeded from there. So that's how I got in. It was tired of the theatre. I wasn't quite as motivated as I had been, looking for some other similar affiliated area in which I could get involved.
And you got the chance to work on Doctor Who. Had you been a fan, and was it amazing to work on something that you had been a fan of, if you were indeed a fan?
Do you know what? I hadn't been a huge fan. Not that I was negative particularly, but it was just not something that, after I was about 10 years old, when I was peering over the vicar's sofa looking at William Martin, I hadn't really tracked it. It was an absolute nightmare. I mean, first of all, because the fan base is so strong that you feel that whatever you do, you're going to get it wrong. A script says, he puts the portal into the what's it. And then you're going to get 150 letters in saying, what the hell, this isn't what happens on the TARDIS. You don't understand this at all. So there's a sort of feeling of constraint on a, well, there was at that time. I can't speak for the Reborn. And it was a difficult time on the show. It had sort of veered into more, frankly, LE areas. Sort of the guest artists were people from other parts of the business, and there's Peter Davison's early episodes. And I did 3 stories there. And then I didn't have a nervous breakdown, but there were moments that came pretty close to that, I must say.
And how would you characterize the corporation at that time? And just looking a little bit further forwards, how do you think the BBC will evolve in the fragmented TV and cultural landscape of the future?
Well, I think it was an absolutely astonishing place. I mean, people always say that about the old days at the BBC. First of all, it was a proper studio. So when I was in AFM, you'd look at the board, you'd see what shows you were on, you'd say, and then you'd say, oh, I'm doing next 6 months, I'm going to do this, and off you'd go. And you were all on campus. You were at Television Centre. You'd go up to the design block. You'd meet with your designer, you'd go to special effects in Acton, and that was an astonishingly positive experience. But for me, as I graduated into the script side, the creative side, I just found it a completely inspirational environment. There were always sort of 20, 30 shows being done at any time, and it was just a very buzzy environment. And for the first time in my life, I saw career paths. I think that was a big difference between nowadays. You could see career paths. Where I do agree, and there was a recently, we're talking now at the beginning of May in 24, that recently the DG made a pronouncement arguing the case for the BBC as an environment which could draw on and defend British talents, the British perspective, the British story choices, things. And I think that's crucially important now. If it's not protected, it will wither with the internationality now of financing, of the way of looking at the world. And frankly, it's quite fashionable to be international co-production. Are you going to grow Sally Wainwright in that environment? Are you going to grow Jed Mercurio in that environment? Or Jack Thorne? I'm very skeptical. So I hope that very much that the BBC will continue to fight that corner.
You also spent a significant part of your early career working in the ITV world in creative roles at Thames Television and Granada. Was there a difference between a BBC and an ITV drama then? And is that something that you still see on screen as a viewer?
Well, I had 3 stints at ITV. In actual fact, the first stint I had was when I was lifted out of the BBC to join Euston Films, which is a subsidiary of Thames, the place that produced The Sweeney and Minder and many other very compelling dramas in the 1980s. And I think the biggest distinction there, and one reason I was so excited and flattered to join them, was it was the place that was only doing film drama. I don't know necessarily that there was a huge difference. I mean, at that time, we're talking many, many decades ago, they were both emphatically public service broadcasters. We would, sit down and censor our scripts in exactly the same kind of way. I remember just anecdotally, first time I saw this word in a script coming through, Kinnel, Kinnell. And of course, that was the way they got around the fucking in those days. So I mean, those sorts of rules, and there were rules in ITV about you couldn't plug things in shows. I think they were very, very similar at that time. When I went back later on to join Granada domestically in the UK, I think it had changed a little bit. I don't think the range was quite the same as the BBC, and now I'm not sure where it's headed. But I think it's noteworthy that the single most resonant show this year, and probably for 5 years more, came from ITV, and that's Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. Huge popular success, plus very high creative values as well. Delighted to see, because Patrick Spence, who was the executive producer, I worked with him at Thames. I brought him in as a script editor for a short period, but I'm thrilled that his career has reached such a zenith. It's fantastic.
In 1989, you joined Working Title as head of TV production. One of the recent trends has been for feature film producers to move into high-end TV series production, I guess lured by creative and commercial possibilities. But 30 years ago, Working Title was really probably ahead of its time in that regard. What took them into TV, and were there differences between developing and producing TV series in a film business as opposed to the broadcast-based businesses that you'd been involved in up until that point?
Truth be told, I think that financing independent films at that time was not always easy. And they thought that by going into the TV business, they might find something a bit more stable. And this was certainly encouraged by Polygram, Michael Kuhn, who they had recently invested in the company. For me, in the small little patch that was television in the early days there, the great thing was the talent relationships extended to the agent relationships. It really, Working Title was an astonishing achievement at that time for those guys and the films they got going. Towards the end of my time there, it was 4 weddings, and then it went in a completely new direction. But there wasn't anything fundamentally different. I think film business, as independent producers putting money together to make films, they were used to being in the driving seat a lot more than you could be in TV, where you were reliant on a commissioner, often in those years, a sole commissioner to fully fund your show. So that was a perspective that was different. But everything I did there, I really can't claim that I brought things in. I mean, these were people coming to Working Title because Working Title was Working Title. and thinking, God, that would be a great place to take my project. Tales of the City being a very good example. Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. So I don't think, but then when you get down to it, you're still having to get a script written. You're still having to get a budget done. You're still having to get a crew together. You're still having, so it wasn't so dissimilar.
Tales of the City took you to the US, and in the late 1990s, you returned to LA on a mission from Granada TV to produce scripted TV for non-US markets and to drive their US TV movie and miniseries business. How did you find LA and the US producing and pitching culture? And did talent play a bigger role in projects than in the UK, for example?
Well, how did I find? There were two different experiences. The first was a Tales of City experience. We had a show that was ordered, being paid for by the Brits, by Channel 4. People forget Peter Ansorge, brilliant commissioner at that time, stuck his neck out with Michael Grade standing behind him to do this show, these all American books. And so I, in one sense, started from a position of great strength. Working Title had a sister company, Propaganda, in America, and we were partnered with them, and I was paired with a really, unbelievably good producer, Alan Poole, who worked for them, who then went on to do 6 Feet Under and all kinds of stuff. I had a long career. Tokyo Vice is just done, I think, quite recently. Anyway, so I found it very difficult to work in areas of casting and things. I just didn't know the people. And in a show that, like Tales, had a lot of clever reference points, clever, so and so was just Olympia Dukakis, Laura Linney. There were pieces of casting, like Ian McKellen came in as a dinner guest at once. That I could understand that, but when they started using all these other names of people that were sort of folkloric in American culture, I found it very difficult to be quite so disconnected. We had a British director, was able to talk with Alistair Reid, but I did find it quite difficult. Now, none of that really went away when I went over to the US representing Granada and had this job in the American Granada Entertainment USA, overseeing the movies and minis output, of which there was quite a lot. A lot of people, we all grow up with television in one sense or another. I mean, I said I didn't watch a whole lot. I did watch Danger Man. I did watch The Saint. I did watch The Channel. In fact, I found my Man from U.N.C.L.E. card that I must have written off for when I was 10 or 11 the other day in a box. We all grow up with a knowledge of our industry. But when you go into pitching, when you go in, forget the different style. And I think being used to written pitching versus verbal pitching was a fundamental difference at that time. When people start saying, "Oh yeah, don't you remember Fred? He was in this show. Oh, I loved that show. It was fantastic." It's something that I, as a Brit, never. I mean, I didn't even know what they were talking about. The show, let alone the artist. So, I did find it quite challenging. I think that's one dimension. The second dimension would be that the tone of the industry is a very different tone. If you've grown up in my generation in British TV through the institutions like the BBC and ITV, Hollywood is a very different kind of a place. It's a transactional place. It's driven first by the business, second by the art. And you could say the BBC at that time still had the privilege of being driven by the art, and the business would follow. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it, but I did enjoy it, but I didn't find it easy at all. And the second period was the time when Carlton and Granada were about to come together. So it was one of those corporate conniption moments when there were other challenges, shall we say.
And from a personal point of view, how did you find living in LA?
I wanted to come home after 5 years. I really did. My wife and my daughter would have stayed probably forever. My son was happy to come back. Off the job, it was a marvelous experience, and for me, it was a partly, and that's why I wanted to do it, a psycho journey, because my father was from LA, and I was able to reconnect and go and look at the house that he was brought up in and reconnect with half uncles, and that sort of stuff. No, I loved it, and we're very, socially, we were in a wonderful community, and some of those are still our closest friends. My daughter's closest friends is still a group of American girls that she was at middle school and high school with there. We went over to a wedding of one of them last year. So it was a very enriching experience for me, for my family, on a personal level. Very, very enriching.
In 2005, you did what you said you wanted to do, which is to return to the UK, and that was with Sony Pictures Television.
Yeah.
You were at that point SVP of European production. What was the brief, and how did life in a US studio but based in London compared to executive life working for a British studio in LA?
Come back to the brief in a minute. The most obvious difference is that if you're in LA working for a British company, no one's going to call you after noon. If you're working for an American company in London, they might be calling you at 9 o'clock. And there was something wonderfully freeing about spending from 7 o'clock until 12 o'clock worrying about the Brits, sitting behind a desk in Los Angeles. I think that the brief was straightforward, really, although there were the complications. The very successful international production business that the international group under Michael Grindon had built, there was a feeling that they needed to support the European production houses. They had their own production labels in 4 or 5 European countries, and the job was really to work with those companies and try and help them build their businesses. This was part of course, as I experienced again in HBO, not all of the companies shared the same excitement about someone else coming in outside. The second part of the brief was, although it was a very strong formats business, both scripted formats and historic unscripted formats. The most modern one was Dragon's Den, but there were a lot of game shows and stuff in the catalogue. This was the period at which Got Talent was bursting all over the universe. There was a real sense that they ought to be in that business more than they were. So the brief was to support and I think to grow the unscripted business. And we decided to grow the unscripted business through some investments in the UK and in Holland in unscripted companies. And if I should be eternally grateful for the experience that I had in that phase. It was a whole new thing for me to be involved in business, biz dev stuff, flying around with biz dev person, meeting people in Warsaw whose companies we could invest in, or in Holland. So it really did expand my perspective on the industry. I also, that period of my life, I was learning about European TV. I was a Brit who went to America, so I got the Anglosphere locked up, but I didn't really, I hadn't dealt properly with French and German and Spanish and Italian and these other and Dutch and these other countries. So that was a wonderful education opportunity. So yeah, I got a huge amount out of it.
And I suppose in some ways that laid some of the groundwork for your later role that began in 2011 when you took up the position of EVP, Original Programming and Production at HBO Europe. How did being a buyer different from being a seller and a producer?
Very interesting question. I'm not a natural salesman. I never was. And that would have, had I been foolish enough to start an independent production company, I would have fallen at the first fence. You, Danny, you've been in the sales side of a lot of your career, and so you've got to feel easy with that. I don't feel very easy with that. So, one thought I had was, why didn't I discover being a buyer earlier in my career? Why did I have to wait till now? But it is obviously a very different experience. I just feel very blessed that it was a case of save the best till last, because everything that I had learned over a long career was able to come together at that moment. I was someone who understood American speak, and so I could represent. I could be the simultaneous translator, which is a lot of what I did in the Granada job in America, was simultaneously translating what actually the Brits meant when they said this to an American team and vice versa. So I was very comfortable working with the American side of HBO. I was also very comfortable building a business, and that was something I didn't know I'd be comfortable at. There was certain infrastructure, but we had to make changes. We had to grow it very fast in Central Eastern Europe. This was to begin with. But the HBO brand has to be a gift, in a sense, to everybody, because it was so well defined that you didn't have to agonize a lot about whether you should do something or not. We didn't do enough to, risk the family silver if we screwed up. One show a year in each of 4 countries. And the brief was pretty simple. It was interpret the HBO brand in these different countries. This is the initial HBO Europe phase. It transitioned to other things later, but what did that mean? It's do what other broadcasters aren't doing, look for cinema talents, make it something that an audience wants to pay for as opposed to get for nothing. Give it decent production value so it doesn't look like some cheap add-on at the end of the day. I mean, there are certain editorial criteria that were very straightforward. And once we started to do it, I felt very, very fortunate I had such a defined brand. I think being a buyer in a broadcast environment that has a much broader purposes is a very different kind of job to the one that I actually had in the context of HBO Europe and later HBO Max.
On the last podcast, Will Harrison, who was a colleague of yours, explained that local programming was a key differentiator for HBO Europe. Did the content that you were bringing to the service also have other dimensions, for example, perhaps a bit more mass market to attract a wider local audience than US programming with a particular US pay TV dimension to it?
Yes, it absolutely had, but I wouldn't at that phase of the development of the company necessarily call it mass market. Linda Jensen was the inspired leader at that time. She had two goals when she recruited me. One was to get into local programming in order that you connected with local audiences in a different way than the way you connected with them in American programming. And secondly, to get much further into online distribution, and that was the HBO Go phase in the development of the company. So there were these two things, and I had a very free hand to interpret the HBO brand. And I'm glad to say when we made a show in any of those territories, it always came in number 2 after Game of Thrones on the Nielsen's at that time. Now, people can say, well, Nielsen is such a small sample, so that's not really true. I had that argument back. But the fact is they made a huge cultural impact. When you do an HBO kind of a show, you hear it in your own language, you see it with the movie stars that you see from your local cinema productions, perhaps with a named director. And these were very, very impactful shows, sometimes at their best, culturally impactful. We did things that were front page news on the news sections that weren't just on the TV pages there. We were able to feel that we had fulfilled the HBO brand and sort of done what they do in America.
And do you have a perspective on how the rollouts of Max will dovetail with the traditional HBO positioning, certainly in the European territories that you were responsible for?
Well, I think the industry has changed even in the year that I've been away from HBO Europe and HBO Max, and I was commissioning and overseeing the originals for Max for a couple of 2 years, 3 years. It's a dilemma that all the business people had to get their minds around, and they ultimately came down on a side. HBO Max, the idea was it's HBO, but we're giving you a whole lot more. And that was a philosophical point, and so we tried to do that, and they tried to do that in the United States. Then it becomes Max, and you've dropped the HBO from the proposition. And HBO is a button on your thing, but you can also get Discovery this, the Olympics. I don't know, who does know how that would ultimately play. I always thought that there was room for a profitable streaming service that had both the positives and some of the negatives, which were, some would say it was an elitist network on HBO. It wasn't for everybody. I thought there might be a place for continuing more of that than going to try and offer something for everybody. But history will tell whether it's going to work out for everybody or not. Obviously, cleverer minds than mine on the business side were thinking about that. But I have to observe that the share price is 70% or more below what it was 3 years ago. So
producing great TV and film is a product of creative instincts, a practical understanding of physical production and performance, and financial acumen. And I think that you've covered all of those bases tremendously well. Are TV or successful TV producers born, or are they made?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both. Well, first of all, to say, I'm not really a producer. I've been an executive producer. My skills have been managing the interface between the company, the money, and as it were, and expectations of the buyer and the creative talents. I think the best producers of film and TV, and I go back to someone like Tim Bevan at Working Title, have a fire in the belly and a natural entrepreneurial streak that they can't learn, I suspect. I think it's just there. Then, if they're lucky enough to have opportunities to watch other people doing it, grow through the industry, all the rest of it, then I think they've got the magic combo if you want to be a successful producer.
And looking back, who were the mentors and colleagues that you learnt the most from? And what advice would you pass on to the next generation of execs coming through?
I've learned literally from almost everybody that I've ever worked with. In the early days, watching directors, both in the theatre and in TV. It's almost invidious to pick names. I guess, I do owe a lot to the people who started my career, Graham MacDonald, and then was succeeded by David Reed, who were the head of series and serials at the BBC, who gave me wonderful opportunities. I learned a lot from watching just Tim Bevan and his colleagues at Working Title work in a completely different way to one that I had ever been used to. A really big influence on me was a lady called Andrea Wanfer, who was the managing director of Granada Productions when I was at Granada, and it was she that sent me to America. And she was an inspirational person. She's sadly no longer with us, but she was an inspirational person, and she really understood what it was like to do the creative job because she'd done it herself. And I suppose that would lead to a general reflection that the places that I have felt most fulfilled in a career have been those places where production came before distribution or running channels or anything. So I have to say that about the BBC. I would certainly say it about Euston Film. I would certainly say it about Working Title. I think it's more difficult when the production is within a distribution division, because the distribution division has ultimately got different ways of looking at the world. And I'm not judging, I'm just observing the differences. And I've had 2 or 3 of those experiences as well. But I think Andrea was absolutely. But I think the other thing for someone doing the work I did was that your mentors are often not in the companies. Or I have to say the agent community, the literary and directors and agencies, I owe an enormous amount to people like Stephen Durbridge, Norman North, Anthony Jones, and the late Jenny Casarotta, who sadly died this year, who always were plugged in everywhere all the time because that was their business. They needed to know who was buying what, who the upcoming talent was, what. And those, I feel indebted to all those and many other agents who supported me, helped me understand the lay of the land, steered me, passed me a project they thought I could sell and another person couldn't sell, or a talent that I could sell, work with. And but the truth be told, if you're lucky enough to work in this industry, you learn from everybody you encounter all the time if you're really good. So what would I say to somebody now? I would say no one has a single uninterrupted line through their career. There are many ups and downs and longeurs, but if you are motivated not only by personal greed and personal, ego requirements, and feel that there's something bigger going on here that you can be part of, I think it's the most wonderfully satisfying job. The things that I will remember are some of the letters that I was able to see written to Channel 4 after Tales of the City from, someone I vividly remember reading one about a father saying, now you've made me help me understand my son. And I thought, my goodness. And some of the shows we've done in Central Eastern Europe have really touched people and made them think about things. So I think, I say to people, hang into the bigger values of what you're trying to do, albeit the industry is, not always helpful with that. Keep the faith and try and do things that are worth something. And by the way, I go back to Mr. Bates. That was a worthwhile project from every measure that you could possibly want to apply to something. And I think the second thing I would say would be this industry is always in flux. At least 3 times in my career, I've sat in my office wondering who's in charge today, what's going on, what do they really want? I was very much present for the Pearson Thames acquisition, then for the Carlton Granada joining up, and then again Discovery coming into, well, Warner Media becoming one, and then Discovery. It's very easy to be disheartened by this corporate stasis that you get at times like this. And I would just say to people, again, hold the faith. This is a constantly in flux. If necessary, reinvent yourself. Try and do things that you didn't do before. Because, as I go back to, if you're doing it for the right reasons, it will all work out.
Finally, I always like to finish with a fun question about media. So, if there was an American Antony Root doppelganger who was doing your journey in reverse, so immersing themselves in UK culture, which TV series, film, book, and theatre production would you advise them to see to help them get immersed in the UK?
From an industry perspective, I'd have to say, go out and watch anything that Sally Wainwright has written. And I'm talking about the TV part of your question. Anything Sally Wainwright has written, anything Jed McCure has written, anything Jack Thorne's written. Go and watch this amazing directing community we have, and acting community we have. You'll get the feel of of the range and depth that isn't always present in American work, for instance. The creative industries in this country still offer. And similarly, I would say the same about the movies. Zone of Interest, in my view, was the finest film, the most lasting film, the deepest film of the year. Go and see that sort of stuff, and remember it's British, although it may not be in English. It's a British film. All of Us Strangers, Andrew Haig's piece was fantastic. You can get to know the country watching those kinds of things as you can the TV shows. There's so many wonderful novelists, and give lists of names. I'm out of touch with the theatre, to be perfectly honest. I'm not connected well enough. But we are very fortunate to still have, and that's why, again, the BBC and our places like it are so important, an enormous, rich heritage in the performing arts, in the film crafts and film arts and television. And I think we should treasure it and value it. And I would just tell this person to go and dive in.
Very good. Well, Antony Root, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast and sharing so many amazing memories from an incredible career. And just on a personal note, it's a throwback for me to the days when you and I and Chris Pye would retire to the local sushi restaurant to put the world to rights. So it's been great to have you on the podcast.
Danny, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope some of what I said will be interesting to other people.
Absolutely will be.